Did I do it, Danielle?
Yep, looks good. Well, thanks. Hi, everyone. I'm Danielle Tuft. I'm the RPE director in Colorado. I also have Lillian Chamuma, who's our SVP evaluator, who's going to be helping me out at the very end of this presentation, and then will be in the breakout room with us to help us unpack further conversations. But I think I'll start in sort of echoing what I think all the presenters so far have said, which is that we are all kind of learning in this journey around equity and anti-oppression and anti-racism work. And a lot of this presentation is actually acknowledging mistakes that we've made as a program and attempts that we've started working towards to kind of rectify some of those when we think about data. I'll keep going. It's no worries. Anyway, so we will talk a little bit about that. And then most of it is sort of, because we only have 10 minutes, just a surface level conversation around it and an opportunity to kind of break it out and unpack sort of what our solutions have started to look like and how they've sort of taken shape, knowing that we still have a lot to learn. So next slide. So what I'm going to talk about is actually two intersecting projects that we have done to focus more on equitable evaluation in particular. So I want to start a little bit by talking about our data review meetings, which are sort of broad-based meetings that we hold with stakeholders. Next slide. But before we kind of look at some of the data, this is sort of an acknowledgement statement that we've put out there when we have any of our data conversations. And so I just want to read the top portion real quick, which is that the SVP program in presenting data across various demographics as part of this discussion acknowledges that the identities are not risk factors themselves. However, there are racist and oppressive systems at play that historically and currently limit choice, access, and influence over what decisions communities are able to make. Further, experiencing multiple and intersecting forms of oppression leads to compounded and multi-generational traumas. And so this was our initial start in the acknowledgement that oftentimes we rely on quantitative data that really doesn't tell the whole story, and really wanting to set the frame for how folks are even first looking at the data we further present. Next slide. So a lot of this conversation started from the way we see the problem is the problem. So we focus a lot with quantitative data. We know that there are a lot of limitations in sexual violence around quantitative data, but oftentimes that's what we have the capacity for. And the challenge with that is quantitative data is often boxes, right? What box to select, how to identify, and realistically, that is incredibly challenging for an individual to identify within. And oftentimes it doesn't fully represent the context or experience of any given individual or community. And so this is really where we started to think about like, oh, we've got some work to do. Next slide. So I wanted to talk a little bit about our data review meetings. So as part of these meetings, our goal was to really present data back to our stakeholders. It was a wide variety of stakeholders, anyone from internal within our state health department, our advisory team for our sexual violence work. We have a community action board or advisory board for our state health department that we presented to, our grantees themselves. So really sort of that responsibility in bringing the data back to our communities and really asking them to help us understand and interpret what it meant. So beyond just sort of the numbers, like what did this mean in your community? What does this actually look like? So we hosted a series of 4 meetings in 2020. We actually did this again in an iterative process in 2021, but we reviewed both process and outcome data with a focus on seeking that interpretation. And the goal was a lot of what I've already shared in really thinking through like, what is it that we've achieved? How can we improve the work that we're doing? And how do we use local contextualization to really help drive those analyses or decisions that we're making? So like I said, we did this first in 2020. We learned a lot. We made some mistakes. We changed a little bit in our movement in 2021. We still have some opportunities to grow from there, and we can share more in the breakout. But next slide. So this is just to share a little bit of where we started. So this was a set of graphs that we used, or charts that we used from 2020. And what we learned when we presented this to stakeholders, particularly our community advisory board, who doesn't actually hold professional expertise in sexual violence, but does hold a lot of lived experience across multiple different identities and experiences, basically looked at this and was like, yeah, this means nothing to me. Like, this doesn't reflect my life. This doesn't reflect my challenges. Like, I don't even know how to read this, let alone like have it actually explain what we're experiencing. And we actually showed this with perpetration data as well, which I'll share in the next slide. But this was really the start for us of like, oh, great. We thought we were doing so well in creating these like really pretty, colorful slides. And like, this was actually building up from what we had previously done. And what we learned was that we were still very much missing the mark for our community and really providing back the information that they were sort of pretty generously providing us. So next slide. And then we have this really amazing opportunity because in 2019, we finally, after several years, got perpetration questions added to our YRBS, or Colorado's version is called Healthy Kids Colorado survey. So we added questions. We actually just added more perpetration questions as well as victimization questions to the 2021. So we should get that data in the next week or so. And it was really exciting. And then we got the data and it looked like this. And we were like, uh-oh, this data is going to reinforce a lot of really harmful stereotypes and have the potential to be weaponized. Because as you can see, our most marginalized communities are also showing up as those who are having the highest percentages of self-reported perpetration. And so we were like, well, we have a duty of sorts as a state health department to make this data available. It isn't our data to begin with. We need to share it out. But this could really backfire and create a lot of opportunity for further harm in our communities. What do we do? So one of the first things we did was actually go to our community advisory board and show them this. And what we learned from that was A, this representation of the data is useless for them. And B, was that we had to find a way to really pair it with more contextual information and narrative and qualitative data to actually give a stronger understanding of what it is we're trying to represent and the experiences that intersect with what we're seeing on this graph. So I'm not going to go through sort of those pieces, but again, next steps, breakout, we would love to chat more. So that's sort of big picture. That's fine. You can move on to the next one. That was sort of big picture. Within these data review, we also really looked at some of our process and sort of initial impact data for each of our grantees, because we really wanted to hold ourselves accountable to say, like, if we're taking an anti-oppressive approach or anti-racist approach, how are we actually showing that we're having the impact with those that are who are most experiencing different forms of violence? And so we did these equity audits. We've done them a couple times and hopefully gotten better each time. Next slide. So what we did was engaging our grantees in really critical evaluation of their efforts. So we basically, and I say we, I really want to put props out to Ray Gupta, who is our coordinator. Ray is unable to join today because Ray got married on Sunday. So total props for Ray taking the time off. But Ray put together all of these graphs you'll see in a moment. So I really want to acknowledge that work. But we engaged the grantees in that process and really wanted to see what was the impact of the work that our grantees were doing individually at the local level for the community work that they were doing. And were we seeing an impact in the communities and populations that we were trying to prioritize? This is also not a one-time exercise. So we've been doing this annually with our grantees, but there is an expectation that they're doing other equity assessments as part of their contracts with us throughout the year. So there's multiple mechanisms to review, and this is just an opportunity for us all to come together as sort of a cohort to learn from one another and identify where there's opportunities and strengths and gaps. Next slide. So again, this is sort of where we started in year one. We were like, okay, how do we measure our accountability for this work? Well, let's start by seeing who all we reached in Colorado via our efforts compared to the makeup of students statewide. And when you look at this, we're like, okay, like this seems okay. Like at the very least, we're hitting or we're matching the representation of demographics in Colorado across the state. Like that seems okay. But then we unpacked it a little bit and we're like, but is it? Like, is this success? So next slide. So then the following year, we did something similar to this slide for each of our grantees, and we really narrowed our denominator of sorts. We sort of looked at, instead of looking at an entire county, let's really think about who they're hoping to impact. So we looked at all of the schools, and in this case for this particular grantee, that they were working in as part of our grant program. And then we looked at who they reached. So what we can see is in this community, they have more Latinx students, but they were still serving more white students. And so it was an opportunity for us to really unpack this data in a much different way, to really be able to look at it and better understand where there were opportunities to change or strengthen implementation. Next slide. And these are similar examples and what happens when we don't do this work. So similarly, this is between the last 2 years. So in the 2020, I believe, is on the left and 2021 on the right. So year 2 and year 3. And what this shows is, like, during COVID, work generally stayed the same, which we saw as a huge success, because I think we all know COVID was a massive barrier to lots of things. And so we were like, great, like, work didn't inherently decline as a result of this. But then we decided to unpack this further. Next slide. And what we saw was that even though the work generally stayed the same, which is definitely a success, there was still an overrepresentation of folks in white communities that were impacted by the results or work of this particular grantee, even though the workforce, because in this case, they're working with economic stability through employment, even though white and Latinx communities were almost equal in the county, it was significantly more represented that they were working with white communities. And so while we saw success when we looked at this bigger picture, when we unpacked it further and kind of narrowed the scope, we understood a little bit more about what those equity impacts were. And I think that's what has been most critical in this work for us, has been able to see the necessity and not just relying on those big picture pieces, and really taking sort of a deeper dive and understanding the specificities happening on the local context. Next slide. And this is just another example of, like, where we've been moving to in terms of how we've been trying to progress the way we've been visualizing our data. Those of you who worked with Stephanie Evergreen, this will look super familiar. We also have been receiving coaching from Heather Kraus with We All Count. So another resource, if you're not using, I highly encourage. But next slide. And in our last minute, hopefully I didn't go over, I just wanted to bring Lillian in to share a little bit about lessons learned and next steps, because these are really the pieces that Lillian is guiding forward in her role as an evaluator.
Okay, great. How much time do we still have? I was trying to track and I'm not sure if I have the right.
Teeny tiny is what I saw from Jen.
Okay, just tell me if I go over. I tend to enjoy talking about this stuff. So lessons learned. I think, as you noticed as Danielle went through the presentations, you'll notice that, we highlighted the need for more learning and what's going on, right? This is an ongoing process. We are learning lessons as we go, but also things change, right? As you notice, even with COVID, we got different results. We have new things going on now, new challenges that folks are navigating. So I'm sure that will also change our work. But I think just being cognizant of what is happening in the communities, trying, we've done, like through this work, you'll notice that we mentioned grantees, advisory board. So it's really trying to bring the community through some representatives of some sort. And this is trying to take away the power from the department. I saw Sierra, partly to your question, we'll talk more in the groups, in the small groups, but it's really trying to engage them in the conversations. What is this? What are we saying? And through the whole process, right? When we collect data, when we create our surveys, when we get that information, and also bringing back when we get our information, but also present it, because how you present it is a key role. Danielle also mentioned the resources and efforts that we're making to educate also ourselves in data visualization. You'll notice Ray, our colleague, did most of that work, getting the visuals and everything, and really trying to see different ways to present the data and highlight information that's to make it more meaningful to our grantees, to our communities, and to the others that we are communicating to in the community. And most importantly, to highlight those things that get hidden when we just use numbers or graphs without talking more about who is this and why they're there, and breaking it into the groups and things like that. So we're also looking at so that's the tools that we use. Of course, I'm not reading the slides, so you can read that. But really going into that expertise and continuing to learn as well is one of the areas that we hope to continue on. We also know that quantitative data is always limited, right? We've highlighted that many times. We know that, we talk about it every day. And the historical issue of racism and oppression is really rooted in quantitative data, from the simplest techniques to the assumptions we make to the complex, right? Think about it. When we are looking at quantitative data, we're always thinking ideals, right? Delete outliers, change things, make it work. You want a significant result, right? But now we realize the questions we answer are more complex. All of those numbers matter. And when we do that, while you might do that to really make people feel like, yes, you did the analysis or the results in an appropriate way, you also want to really think about other ways of getting qualitative data into that. So getting into mixed approach, looking at the context, looking at what's going on. And this is where we found value, as Danielle mentioned, going back to discuss with the advisory boards, with the grantees, and also presenting these results and saying, what are we really saying and how do we find it? So with that said, I think I'm gonna stop there. I'm not sure if I went over time, but just really lots of next steps to think about how we present, how we talk about data, and also engaging our communities, especially in the work we do. We know the dynamics of power, being health department in a public setting and other things, right? Politics is a big deal. So kind of countering those and also trying to do justice to the communities and the work that we do is really one of those things that we are trying to work towards. Thank you. And Danielle, do you want to close? Or yeah. I think that's our last slide. So